The ale was flat, the air was thick, and the weary conversations of merchants and farmers were the only music in the Weary Wanderer Inn. Alara moved between the rough-hewn tables, a ghost in a plain brown tunic. She collected empty tankards with calloused hands, her eyes downcast, a habit she had perfected over years of service. To the patrons, she was just a pair of hands that refilled their drinks and cleared their plates. No one saw the quiet observer behind the timid facade, the girl who measured the mood of the room as carefully as she measured out the ale. The air smelled of roasting boar, damp wool, and the faint, ever-present scent of wood smoke that clung to the low, stained ceiling. But beneath it all, for the past week, there had been another scent. Fear. It was thin and sharp, like the smell of iron before a storm. She gathered 3 heavy ceramic mugs, their weight familiar in her grip. Her gaze swept the room without seeming to. Old Thomas was hunched over his drink, his face grim. He ran a small stable, and his best horses had been conscripted for the Royal Army weeks ago. Sarah, who sold woven blankets in the market, was twisting a loose thread on her shawl, her brow furrowed with worry. The whispers had started as a trickle, but now they were a steady current flowing through every corner of the town, right into the heart of this inn. The king, the northern border, a battle against a sorcerous warlord. Victory, they had said at first, a hard-won victory, but the king had not returned to the capital in triumph. He had been brought to Silverspire Keep under the cover of darkness, and a heavy silence had fallen from the castle walls ever since. Alara felt the familiar, cool weight of the small locket hidden beneath her shirt, pressing against her skin. It was a constant reminder of a life she kept buried, a legacy she both cherished and feared. Her mother's voice was a whisper in her memory, a warning from a lifetime ago. Keep your head down. Our light draws shadows. Men of power see our gift not as a miracle, but as a weapon to be controlled or a heresy to be extinguished. So Alara worked. She poured ale, she swept floors, she listened. She was invisible, and invisibility was safety. She moved toward the great hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows that made the familiar room seem strange and uncertain. She placed the dirty mugs in a wooden basin, the clatter loud in a sudden lull in conversation. Then the inn's heavy oak door crashed open, slamming against the stone wall. A blast of cold, wet wind swept through the room, making the fire gutter and hiss. Every head turned. Framed in the doorway stood a squadron of royal knights. They were not the gleaming figures from parade grounds or storybooks. Their steel breastplates were dented and smeared with mud. Their blue cloaks were dark with rain and travel stains. Exhaustion was carved into their faces, deep lines of it around their eyes and mouths. They carried their helmets under their arms, and their hair was matted with sweat and rain. They looked less like victors and more like survivors of some terrible wreck. The man at their head, the captain, had a gash high on his cheekbone that was poorly stitched. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on nothing, and the usual boisterous energy of the inn evaporated. The silence was thick and heavy with unspoken questions. The captain's gaze settled on the bar, and he strode forward, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the clean-swept floorboards. His men followed, finding an empty corner table and slumping onto the benches with the dead weight of men pushed far beyond their limits. They leaned their swords against the wall, the sound of metal scraping against wood unnaturally loud. "Oh," the captain said to Alara, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It was not a request. "For all of us." Alara nodded, her heart starting to beat a little faster. She kept her eyes on the wooden taps, pulling the levers and filling the tankards with practiced efficiency. She could feel the captain's stare on her back. He was not looking at her, not really. He was looking through her, his mind still on some dark northern battlefield. She lined the foaming mugs up on a wooden tray. Her hands were steady, but a tremor started deep inside her. These were the king's own men. They had been with him. They knew. She carried the heavy tray to their table. As she set the tankards down, the metallic scent of old blood and wet metal rose from their armor. One of the younger knights was staring into the fire, his eyes wide and unfocused. He looked no older than 20. Another, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, was rubbing his temples as if trying to erase a persistent, painful memory. None of them reached for the ale immediately. They just sat, cloaked in a shared, silent despair. The captain took a long, slow swallow from his mug and then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He stared down at the dark liquid. "They said it was over," he muttered, his voice just for the men at his table. But Alara was still there, pretending to wipe a spill from the wood. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She had learned long ago that people forget you are there if you seem busy with simple tasks. "The warlord is gone," another knight responded, his voice hollow. "His fortress is rubble. But at what cost?" The captain slammed his tankard down on the table, making the others jump. Ale sloshed over the rim. "The cost is a king who lies dying," he snarled, his voice low but vibrating with a furious, helpless anger. "Struck down by a cursed blade, a shard of it still in him." Alara froze for a fraction of a second. Cursed. The word hung in the air, cold and sharp. So the whispers were true. This was not a simple wound of war. This was magic. Dark magic. "Sorrow's kiss," the young knight whispered, the name of the blade sounding like a profanity. "I saw it. The metal was black. It drank the light." "And now it drinks the king's life," the captain said, his anchor deflating into bleak resignation. He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "Master Valerius has tried everything. The poultices, the salves, the incantations from the royal archives. Nothing works. The wound does not fester like a normal injury. It spreads like a black frost creeping under his skin. The flesh turns cold and gray wherever it touches." Alara felt a cold dread wash over her. She could almost picture it. This was not the work of ordinary poison or infection. This was a living curse, a magic designed not just to kill, but to consume. It was a corruption of life itself. Her fingers twitched, an old instinct to reach for the locket hidden beneath her tunic. She resisted the urge, forcing her hand to continue wiping the table in slow, meaningless circles. She had to stay invisible. Her secret was a dangerous one. The royal conclave, the arbiters of all magic in the kingdom, hunted down those who wielded what they called wild arts. Her gift, passed down from her mother and her mother's mother, was the wildest of all. It was a magic of pure life, an art not found in any of their approved texts. To them, she would be a heretic. The inn door opened again, this time with less force but more consequence. A man swept into the room, his fine gray robes immaculate despite the rain. He was thin, with sharp bird-like features and a neatly trimmed beard. His hands, pale and slender, were clasped behind his back. It was Master Valerius, the royal physician himself, the most respected healer in the entire kingdom. The knights at the corner table fell silent, their faces tightening. The captain straightened his back, a flicker of defiance in his weary eyes. Master Valerius did not acknowledge them. He did not acknowledge anyone. His gaze was fixed on some distant point, and he moved through the crowded inn as if parting a sea of lesser beings. He was not here for a drink or for comfort. The weary wanderer was merely a shortcut, a path between the main street and the private stables that served the keep. But his presence was a proclamation. His face was a mask of cold intellectual fury. It was the face of a man whose vast knowledge had just been proven worthless. The face of a proud man who had failed, and failed publicly. The cloying scent of medicinal incense and failure wafted from him, a stark contrast to the earthy smells of the inn. Alara watched him pass. She saw the slight tremble in his supposedly steady hands. She saw the deep frustration in his cold blue eyes. He was a man who believed the world could be understood completely through books and precise measurements. He would see a curse as a puzzle to be solved, not a living entity to be confronted. He would have used logic and lore against an enemy that fed on life force. It was like trying to catch smoke with a net. He passed within arm's length of her, his robes whispering against the floorboards, and for a moment his eyes met hers. There was no recognition, just a flash of irritated dismissal. He saw a serving girl, a piece of the scenery. He saw nothing. And then he was gone, out a back door and into the rainy courtyard beyond. The moment he left, a collective breath was released. The tension in the room did not disappear, but it changed. The night's grim silence was no longer just about their king's wound. It was now colored by the visible proof that the kingdom's greatest hope had been extinguished. If Master Valerius, with all his resources and ancient knowledge, could not stop the curse, then who could? He looks like he's seen a ghost, one of the farmers at a nearby table murmured. Worse, his companion replied, leaning in. He looks like a man who knows he's about to watch a kingdom fall apart. Alara finally picked up her rag and turned away from the knight's table, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She retreated to the relative safety of the bar, her mind racing. She could feel it, a faint thrum of dark energy on the edge of her senses. It was a distant echo, a cold spot in the world, emanating from the great stone keep that loomed over the town. Silverspire Keep, where King Theron lay dying. His death would not just be a personal tragedy. Theron was the shield of the kingdom. He held the rival dukes and ambitious lords in check. Without him, the fragile peace would shatter. Civil war would be inevitable. The suffering would spread from the royal chambers to every corner of the land, to every farm, every village, every table in this very inn. She began polishing a clean tankard, her motions automatic. Her reflection was a blur in the polished pewter. A plain face, unremarkable brown hair, watchful gray eyes. The face of a girl who was an expert at being overlooked. But beneath the surface, a war was raging. Her mother's warnings echoed against the captain's raw despair. Her fear of the conclave battled with the healer's instinct that screamed within her. To heal was her purpose. It was coded into her very being. To see suffering and do nothing was a betrayal of her blood, of her mother's memory. She moved to clear another table, this one closer to the knights. She worked in silence, her head bowed. The men had finally started drinking, but there was no comfort in it. Their conversation was fragmented, bitter. He fought like a lion, the young knight said, his voice thick with emotion. Even after he was hit, he held the line until we could drive them back. A king's courage, the captain agreed quietly. And this is his reward, to be eaten away from the inside out by some foul sorcery. He stared into his empty mug. I stood in the chamber this morning, with the Queen Regent. Valerius was there. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She bent down, pretending to pick up a dropped spoon, her ear turned towards their table. She needed to hear. She had to know how bad it was. The captain's voice was barely a whisper, a sound of utter defeat that cut through the low din of the inn more effectively than a shout. I heard him, the captain continued, his voice cracking. I heard Master Valerius tell her that there is nothing more to be done. A cold silence fell over the knight's table. Alara stayed crouched by the floor, the spoon forgotten in her hand. One of the other men spoke, his voice strained. Nothing? What does that mean, nothing? The captain looked up, his eyes meeting those of his men, one by one. His face was a mask of grief. It means every healer has tried. Every priest has prayed. Every alchemist has brewed their strongest potion. They've all failed. He took a shaky breath, and the final words came out, flat and terrible and absolute. The king is dying, and no one in this kingdom can save him. The words struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. The sounds of the inn, the fire, the rain outside, all of it faded into a dull roar. All she could hear was that final hopeless pronouncement. The king is dying. In that moment, the fate of the kingdom ceased to be a distant rumor. It became a sharp, undeniable reality pressing down on her. All her fear, all her caution, all her mother's warnings felt small and selfish in the face of such a vast and coming darkness. Without thinking, without conscious thought, her hand flew to her chest. Her fingers closed around the familiar shape of the moon petal locket hidden beneath the rough fabric of her tunic. The tarnished silver was cool against her warm skin, a secret anchor in a world that was about to be swept away by a storm. She clutched it tight, the edges pressing into her palm, a silent vow taking root in her heart, terrifying and unstoppable. The murmur of the previous night had settled into a thick, anxious quiet. In the Weary Wanderer Inn, the morning light struggled through the grimy window panes, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stale air. Alara moved through the common room with a practiced invisibility, her footsteps silent on the worn floorboards. The memory of the night's whispered words, "The king is dying," was a cold stone in her stomach. Every clink of a tankard, every hushed conversation, seemed to echo the kingdom's growing dread. Her hand kept straying to her chest, where the cool, familiar shape of the moon petal locket was hidden beneath her simple tunic. It was a nervous habit, a desperate touchstone to a part of herself she had spent her entire life suppressing. Around mid-morning, a new sound cut through the town's tense hush. It was the sharp, rhythmic beat of a drum, growing closer. Patrons left their ale and crowded the inn's doorway, craning their necks. Alara paused, a damp cloth in her hand, her gaze drawn to the street outside. A royal crier, clad in the silver and blue livery of the crown, marched into the center of the market square. He was a stern-faced man with a powerful voice that needed no magical enhancement to carry. He unfurled a large scroll, the parchment crackling in the sudden silence that had fallen over the crowd. Hear ye, his voice boomed, bouncing off the timber-framed buildings, by decree of the Queen Regent, and with the full authority of the Royal Council. He took a breath, his eyes sweeping over the assembled faces, a mixture of merchants, farmers, and wary townsfolk. Our noble King Theron lies grievously wounded, afflicted by a dark malediction that defies the knowledge of our most learned physicians. A collective gasp, a wave of whispers, rippled through the crowd. It was one thing to hear rumors. It was another to have the despair of the crown laid bare in the public square. The crier let the fear settle before continuing, his voice hardening. Let it be known that a royal reward is offered. 10,000 gold crowns in a title of nobility to any soul, man or woman, who can cleanse this vile curse and restore the health of the king. 10,000 crowns. The number hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. It was a fortune beyond the wildest dreams of anyone present. Alara watched as greed began to war with fear on the faces in the crowd. A nervous energy started to build. Men who sold dubious miracle tonics at the edge of the market suddenly stood a little taller. Women known for their folk remedies and whispered charms exchanged calculating glances. The kingdom's desperation had become a commodity, a golden prize for the bold or the foolish. All who would offer their aid are to present themselves at the main gate of Silver Spire Keep, the crier concluded. May the light guide a true healer to our cause. He rolled up the scroll with a snap, turned on his heel, and marched away, the beat of his drum receding, leaving a buzzing, frantic energy in his wake. Almost immediately, the dam of quiet apprehension broke. The square erupted into a frenzy of motion and excited chatter. Men rushed home to gather poultices and dusty, forgotten books. Charlatans who had been peddling cures for warts now boasted of their expertise in ancient curses. Alara saw a man she knew to be a rat catcher arguing passionately with a baker about the healing properties of certain river muds. It was a spectacle of hope and opportunism, a mad scramble toward the looming silhouette of the keep on the hill. From her post at the window, Alara felt a profound sense of sorrow. They didn't understand. They couldn't. This wasn't a sickness of the body. It was a living shadow, a shard of pure malice lodged in the world. And it was hungry. Throughout the day, the weary wanderer became a staging ground for these hopefuls. They came in for a last tankard of ale to bolster their courage, their voices loud with bravado. A wiry man with ink-stained fingers displayed a tattered scrolls covered in what he claimed were pre-cataclysmic runes. He explained to anyone who would listen that his incantation would drive the darkness out through the king's breath. Another, a portly woman smelling strongly of lavender and delusion, carried a cage of white doves. She insisted that the purity of the birds would absorb the curse if they were released in the royal bedchamber. Alara served them their drinks, her face a neutral mask. She listened to their grand theories and their confident pronouncements. Inside, her heart ached with a terrible certainty. They were all going to fail. Her lineage, the knowledge passed down from her mother and her mother before that, gave her a sense of the magic at play. She could almost feel it, a faint, cold thrum on the edge of her senses, a discordant note in the song of the world. It was a cold, ancient, unintelligent thing. It would not be fooled by colored water or frightened by chanting. It would feed on their useless efforts, perhaps even growing stronger for it. From the inn's upper window, where she was meant to be airing out bedding, Alara watched the procession to the keep. It was a long, slow trickle of people climbing the steep road. And soon after, she saw the same people trickling back down. The change in them was stark. They went up puffed with confidence, their steps brisk. They came down slumped, their face etched with failure and humiliation. The guards at the gate were clearly not suffering fools. The man with the runes had his scroll tossed back at him. The woman with the doves was sent away in tears, her birds still cooped in their cage. One by one, their fleeting dreams of gold and glory were extinguished by the harsh reality of the curse. Some of them trudged back into the inn, their bravado gone, replaced by a sullen silence. They ordered their ale without meeting anyone's eyes and drank it down quickly before slinking away. The atmosphere in the common room grew heavier with each returning failure. The initial excitement had curdled into a deeper, more profound despair. If all these people, with all their varied and strange methods, could not even get past the castle gates, what hope was there? The royal physicians had failed. The kingdom's mystics had failed. And now the common folk and their desperate remedies were failing too. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, a lone figure stopped by the inn's water trough. He wore the armor of a royal guard, though the silver stag on his breastplate was tarnished with grime and his helmet was tucked under his arm. He was young, perhaps no older than Alara herself, with a shock of sandy hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. His face was pale, his eyes wet and haunted. He moved with the heavy weariness of a man who had not slept in days. He ignored the inn's entrance, heading straight for the trough where the horses drank. He cupped his hands and splashed the murky water onto his face, gasping as if it were a shock of cold steel. He drank deeply, thirstily, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The other patrons gave him a wide berth. The sight of a royal guard in such a state was unsettling, a visible sign that the rot in the castle was spreading. Alara watched him from the doorway. Something in his raw desperation called to her. This wasn't the arrogance of the knights from the night before, nor the hollow boasting of the charlatans. This was pure, unvarnished fear. On instinct, she filled a clean wooden cup with fresh, cool water from the wellowed bucket behind the bar. She stepped outside, the dried dust of the street puffing up around her worn leather shoes. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of wood smoke from evening hearths. She approached him slowly, so as not to startle him. "Sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He flinched, his head snapping up. His eyes, a watery blue, were bloodshot and unfocused. For a moment, he looked straight through her, his gaze fixed on some horror only he could see. Then his eyes slowly focused on the cup in her hands. He stared at it as if he had never seen such a thing before. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "This is better than the trough water," she said quietly, holding it out. His hand, covered by a stained leather gauntlet, trembled as he reached for it. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting second. A jolt, like static on a dry day, passed between them. Her breath caught in her throat. It was not a spark of attraction, but a sudden, overwhelming flood of his emotions. Despair, exhaustion, a suffocating sense of helplessness that was so profound it felt like drowning. It was the collective fear of an entire castle, a whole kingdom concentrated in one young man. He took the cup without a word, his grip so tight she thought the wood might splinter. He drank it all in 3 long swallows, his throat working. When he was finished, he just stood there, holding the empty cup, his shoulders slumped. He finally met her eyes again. This time, he truly saw her, and in his gaze, Alara saw the reflection of her own terrible conflict. His eyes were pleading. They didn't know what she was, what she could do, but they begged for an end to the suffering. They begged for a miracle. He was a soldier, sworn to protect his king, and he was failing. The silent question in his eyes was a physical weight. Is there anyone left who can help us? Alara had no answer. She could only stand there, her heart hammering against her ribs. The locket beneath her tunic felt impossibly heavy, a secret that burned against her skin. The guard gave her a short, jerky nod, a gesture that was part gratitude, part dismissal. He placed the empty cup on the edge of the trough, turned, and began the long, slow walk back up the hill toward Silver Spire Keep, a man returning to his post in a losing war. Alara watched him until he was just a small, solitary figure against the darkening sky. The silent exchange had shaken her more than any shouted proclamation or whispered rumor. The king's suffering was no longer a distant story. It had a face. It had the haunted, pleading eyes of a young soldier who was watching his world crumble. She retreated back into the inn, the warmth and noise of the common room feeling alien and distant. She went about her duties mechanically, her mind miles away, up on the hill in the cold stone fortress, where a king was being consumed by shadow. That night, sleep did not come easily. Alara lay on her thin straw mattress in her small attic room, listening to the muffled sounds of the inn winding down below. The moon was a pale sliver, offering little light through her tiny window. She closed her eyes, trying to force her mind into blankness. But the day's events played over and over. The crier's voice, the hopeful, then defeated, faces of the charlatans, the young guard's desperate eyes. When sleep finally took her, it offered no respite. It pulled her into a dream that was cold and suffocating. She was not in her room anymore, but floating in a vast, empty darkness. There was no sound, no light, only a profound and penetrating chill that sank into her bones. In the distance, she could see a single point of faint, sickly light. It was Silver Spire Keep, but it was wrong. The stone towers looked brittle, as if they were made of ash. From the heart of the keep, something was pulsing. It was not a light or a sound, but a presence, a dark, creeping tendril of pure void snaked out from the royal chambers. It moved like a thorny vine, slow but relentless, wrapping itself around the castle's foundations. Where it touched, the stone seemed to decay, to lose its substance. Alara could feel its hunger. It was an ancient, malevolent consciousness, tasting the life force of the king, savoring it, drawing it out with agonizing slowness. It was the essence of the cursed blade, sorrow's kiss, and it was alive. In her dream, she felt a phantom pain ignite in her own side, a mirror of the king's wound. It was a cold fire burning away her strength, leaving nothing but weakness and despair. She heard whispers on the edge of her hearing, a sibilant, dry language that spoke of decay and endings. The curse was aware. It knew it was being watched. The tendril of darkness seemed to turn its attention toward her, sensing her, a tiny flicker of opposing energy in the vast emptiness. Panic seized her. She was exposed, vulnerable. She tried to run, to pull away, but she was frozen in the formless void of the dream. The dark tendril began to stretch towards her across the chasm of night. It was slow, deliberate, confident. It was coming for her. Just as the tip of the shadow was about to touch her, a soft, silvery white light bloomed in the center of her dream self's chest. The moon petal locket. It pulsed with a gentle warmth, a quiet but defiant light that held the encroaching darkness at bay. The whispers hissed in frustration, recoiling from the pure, clean light. The shadow vine paused, hesitating. Alara woke with a sharp, ragged gasp, sitting bolt upright in her bed. Her room was dark and silent, the dream's chill still clinging to her skin. She was drenched in a cold sweat, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. The phantom pain in her side was gone, but the memory of it was terrifyingly real. Shaking, she fumbled for the leather cord around her neck and pulled the locket from beneath her nightshirt. The metal was cool against her clammy palm, a solid, real thing in the terrifying dark. She had not just dreamed of the curse, she had felt it, and it, in turn, had felt her. The dream's cold fingers lingered long after she awoke. Alara moved through the morning motions of the weary wanderer as if in a trance, her body performing the tasks her mind could not focus on. The heavy scent of stale ale and greasy smoke clung to the air, a familiar smell that usually grounded her. Today, it only made her feel trapped. She drew water from the well, the rope coarse against her palms, the bucket heavy. She stoked the hearth, the warmth on her face a stark contrast to the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The nightmare had been more than a dream. It was a feeling, a taste of the rot that was spreading from Silver Spire Keep, a living darkness that pulsed with hunger. Her hands found the familiar rhythm of work, a refuge from the spiraling thoughts. She stood behind the bar, a damp cloth in one hand, a stack of pewter tankards in the other. One by one she polished them, her arm moving in slow, deliberate circles. The motion was hypnotic, mindless, The dull gleam of the metal reflected the low morning light filtering through the grimy windows. Swirl, wipe, stack. Swirl, wipe, stack. The repetitive action was a prayer for numbness, a wall against the encroaching dread. But memory was a treacherous thing, stirred by the simplest of motions. The circular movement, the feel of cool metal under her fingers, it all pulled a thread from her past. The scent of the inn faded, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of dried herbs and beeswax. The low ceiling of the tavern dissolved into the familiar rafters of her childhood cottage. She was a girl again, not much older than 10, sitting at a small wooden table. Sunlight thick with dust motes streamed through the open window, illuminating her mother's hands. They were strong hands, like her own would one day be, but they moved with a gentle precision that was all their own. Ilara's mother was showing her the locket for the first time. It was not a gift, but an inheritance, a burden passed down. The locket lay on the table between them, a small, tarnished silver oval on a simple leather cord. It looked unremarkable, something a peddler might sell for a few coppers. But Ilara knew it was more. She could feel a faint, sleeping warmth radiating from it, a quiet hum just beneath the surface of hearing. Her mother's voice was low, a conspiratorial whisper that made the small cottage feel like the safest fortress in the world. This is our legacy, Ilara. It is older than kings, older than the stones of the keep itself. Her mother picked it up, her fingers tracing the worn floral engravings on its surface. Inside is a single petal from a moonflower, plucked from the highest peak of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, under a full eclipse. It holds light, pure light. It is the only thing in this world that can truly answer the deepest dark. The memory was so vivid, Ilara could almost feel the rough wood of the table beneath her own elbows. See the way her mother's brown hair was woven with the first few threads of silver. The magic is not in the petal alone, her mother had continued, her gray eyes, so like Ilara's own, locking onto her. The magic is in our blood. The petal is the key, but we are the lock. It will not work for anyone else. She had taken a small, sharp silver pin from her sewing kit. It asks for a small price, a promise, a piece of you to awaken it. She held the pin out to Ilara. Just a drop. In the memory, Ilara's small hand had trembled as she took the pin. She pricked the tip of her index finger, watching as a perfect, bright red bead of blood welled up. Her mother guided her hand, pressing her bleeding fingertip to the tiny, almost invisible seam of the locket. She whispered a single word, a word that felt like starlight and ancient stone on the tongue. Ilara had whispered it with her. The locket sprang open. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was the petal. It was not dried or brittle, but looked as if it had been plucked that very morning. It was a soft, pearlescent white, and as the air touched it, it began to glow. A gentle, silvery light filled the room, casting soft shadows that danced on the walls. It pushed back the afternoon sun, replacing it with a cool, calming radiance. The light felt alive. It felt like hope. Ilara remembered letting out a gasp of pure wonder. But then her mother's expression had turned serious, the lines around her eyes deepening. She closed the locket, and the magical light vanished, leaving the room suddenly dimmer, sadder. She took Ilara's hands in hers, her grip firm, urgent. Listen to me, Ilara. This is the most important lesson. Our magic, this light, it is a beacon. And beacons do not only guide the lost. They also attract the darkness. They draw shadows. Her mother's voice in the memory was a sharp, painful echo in the present. Men of power will see this and want to own it. Men of dogma, men like the royal physicians and the conclave mages, will see it and want to destroy it. They fear what they cannot control, what is not written in their dusty books. To them, our magic is wild, and they will cage or kill anything wild. You must never, ever reveal what you are, she had pleaded, her eyes filled with a fear Ilara was only now beginning to understand. You heal the small hurts, a fever in the village, a farmer's broken bones set in the dead of night, a babe who will not breathe. You help the common folk who see it as a blessing and ask no questions, but never for the great and powerful. Their world is a furnace that will burn you to ash. Promise me, Ilara. Promise you will stay in the shadows, where it is safe. And Ilara had promised. She had sworn it on the locket, on her mother's love, on the memory of the silvery light. A loud clatter broke the spell. The tankard slipped from Alara's numb fingers, hitting the wooden floor of the inn with a dull, hollow clang. The sound yanked her back to the present. The smell of smoke and ale rushed back in. She was standing behind the bar, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Alara, you all right, lass?" Giles, the innkeeper, was looking at her, his brow furrowed with concern. He was a kind man, with a round belly and a face made for smiling, though he did little of it these days. He saw her as a quiet, dependable worker, perhaps a bit simple. He had no idea of the storm raging inside her. She flinched, startled by his voice. She looked down at the tankard on the floor, then back up at him. She could not find her voice. The promise she made to her mother felt like a physical chain around her throat. Never for the great and powerful. The king was the greatest, the most powerful man in the kingdom. To help him would be to break her most sacred vow. To help him would be to step out of the shadows and into the furnace. She bent down, her movements stiff, and picked up the tankard. Her hands were shaking. She forced a small, tight nod. "Yes, Giles, I'm fine, just tired. Didn't sleep well." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. The truth was she hadn't slept at all. Not really. She had drifted in a sea of feverish images, of a dark wound that pulsed like a second, malevolent heart, of a man's life draining away like sand through her fingers. Giles watched her for a moment longer, his expression unconvinced. "There's a lot of that going around," he said, his voice dropping. He gestured vaguely with his chin towards the few patrons hunched over their morning ale. "The whole town's holding its breath. Every rumor from the keep is worse than the last." He sighed, running a hand over his bald head. "A kingdom without a king. I don't even want to think about it." Alara said nothing. She just turned back to her work, her movements now frantic, jerky. Swirl, wipe, stack. The motion was no longer a comfort. It was a cage. Her mother's warning was a voice of reason, a voice of love and survival. But the feeling from the dream, the gnawing certainty of the curse, it was a different kind of call. It was a duty that went deeper than promises. It was the instinct of a healer, seeing a wound that only she could close. Her lineage was not just about hiding, it was about healing. Her mother had taught her to fear power, but she had also taught her how to mend, how to cleanse, how to bring back life from the brink. Was she meant to let that knowledge wither and die inside her, all for the sake of a promise made in fear? What was the point of holding a light if you were too afraid to use it against the dark? She scrubbed at a stubborn spot on a tankard, her knuckles white. She thought of Master Valerius, the royal physician, with his arrogant face and immaculate robes. He was a man of dogma. Her mother's warning was made for men like him. He would never understand her magic. He would call it witchcraft, heresy. He would see her locked away or burned. The fear was real, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But then she thought of the young guard from the other day, his eyes hollow with despair. She thought of the whispers of civil war, of lords sharpening their swords, ready to carve up the kingdom the moment the king's last breath was drawn. Her fear was for herself, but the kingdom's fear was for everyone. Her safety weighed against the lives of thousands. The calculation was unbearable. She worked through the rest of the morning in a haze of internal conflict. Every clink of a mug, every snippet of conversation she overheard, it all fed her turmoil. "They say the wound, it crawls," one man whispered at the bar. "Black veins spreading up his chest. The physicians can't even look at it anymore." Alara's stomach turned. She knew what that was. It was sorrow's kiss, feeding, consuming. She felt a pull, a physical yearning towards the keep. It was the same sensation she'd had in her dream, the magic in her blood calling to its opposite. It was a dissonant, screaming chord in the quiet song of the world, and every part of her wanted to silence it, to resolve it, to heal it. "Stay in the shadows," her mother's voice urged. "But the man is dying," her own heart cried back. The sun reached its peak, casting a weak, watery light over the town. The inn was quiet, caught in the lull between the morning drinkers and the midday meal. Alara was wiping down the bar, her gaze fixed on the window that faced the street. She could just see the highest spire of the keep over the rooftops. It looked dark and menacing against the pale sky. She clutched the hidden locket beneath her tunic, its cool metal a familiar weight against her skin. It felt heavier today, or maybe she was just weaker. She closed her eyes, trying to block it all out. Just be a serving girl, she told herself. Just polish the tankards and serve the ale and go to your room at night. Forget the king, forget the curse, forget the light you carry. It was a coward's prayer, and she knew it. When she opened her eyes, a single tear traced a path down her dusty cheek. She wiped it away angrily with the back of her hand, and then it came. It was not a loud noise. It was a sound so deep and resonant, it seemed to vibrate in her bones before it ever reached her ears. A single solemn toll of a great bell rolling out from Silver Spire Keep. It echoed across the rooftops, down the cobbled streets, and through the very walls of the Weary Wanderer Inn. The sound was thick with finality, heavy with a sorrow that silenced everything else. The low chatter in the tavern died instantly. Mugs were frozen halfway to lips. Everyone turned to look towards the source of the sound, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. That sound was reserved for only one thing. It was a sound that had not been heard in the capital for over 50 years. It was the sound that announced the passing of a monarch. A single mournful toll for a king's death. The single mournful clang of the bell did not just echo across the town. It pierced the worn wooden walls of the Weary Wanderer Inn and landed like a stone in the gut of every person there. For a breath, there was absolute silence. A farmer named Alistair, halfway through lifting a tankard to his lips, froze with it hovering in the air. Giles, the innkeeper, paused his wiping of the bar, his hands still, the rag dripping soapy water onto the floorboards. The low, rumbling conversations, the scrape of chairs, the hearty laughter from a corner table, all ceased as if a giant hand had smothered the very air. It was a silence deeper than quiet, a void filled with a single, terrible question. Then, the world shattered. Alistair's tankard fell from his numb fingers, crashing against the stone hearth with a deafening clatter that broke the spell. A woman screamed, a short, sharp cry of pure denial. A chair scraped back violently as a merchant shot to his feet, his face pale as milk. "No," he whispered, the word lost in the sudden explosion of noise. "It cannot be." Panic bloomed like a foul, fast-growing weed. Voices rose, overlapping in a chaotic chorus of fear and disbelief. "The king is dead," a man with a blacksmith's soot on his brow declared, his voice rough with shock. "Theron is gone." His words were a spark in a tinder dry room. The patrons surged towards the windows, shoving and craning their necks, as if they could see the truth written in the darkening sky above Silver Spire Keep. "Gods preserve us," an old woman sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "The warlords from the north, they'll break the border before the moon turns." "Forget the border," a finely dressed traveler spat, his hands shaking. "The barons will tear the kingdom apart fighting for the throne. There will be civil war." His eyes were wide with a merchant's terror, seeing not a fallen king but canceled trade routes, burning fields, and lost fortunes. The warm, smoky air of the inn grew thick with the sour scent of fear. Men who had been sharing jokes moments before now looked at each other with suspicion, their community dissolving into a collection of frightened individuals. Giles slammed his fist on the bar. "Hold your tongues," he roared, his voice barely cutting through the din. "We do not know for certain. It could be a warning, a drill." But his own face was ashen, his words hollow. He knew, as they all did, the grim tradition of that single solitary bell. It was not a call to arms. It was a final, sorrowful farewell. Through it all, Ilara stood frozen in the center of the room. She held a heavy wooden tray laden with clean, empty mugs. The bell's toll had not just reached her ears, it had vibrated through the soles of her worn shoes, up her spine, and settled as a block of ice in her chest. The chaotic shouting of the patrons became a distant, meaningless roar, like the sea crashing against a cliff face far away. Her world had narrowed to the weight in her hands and the crushing, suffocating pressure in her lungs. Her mother's voice, a ghost from a sun-drenched memory, whispered in her mind, "Our gift is a light, Ilara, and light draws shadows. Men of power, men of dogma, they will see our light not as a miracle, but as a fire to be stamped out." The memory was so vivid she could almost smell the crushed herbs on her mother's fingers. For years, that warning had been her shield, her justification for staying hidden. It was the reason she polished tankards while a king lay dying only a mile away. She had convinced herself that fear was wisdom. She had told herself that her life, her freedom, was more important than a duty she had never asked for. Now that wisdom felt like cowardice. The bell was not just an announcement of death. It was an accusation. It was the sound of her own failure. He's gone. The thought was not a whisper, but a scream inside her own head. He's gone, and I did nothing. I let him on die. Guilt, cold and sharp, stabbed through the ice in her chest. It was a more profound pain than the dark magic she had sensed in her dreams. That had been a foreign entity, a creeping horror from the outside. This was a sickness from within. The weight of the tray in her hands suddenly became unbearable. It was not just wood and pottery. It was the weight of a life she might have saved, the weight of a kingdom she had let fall. Her fingers, usually so steady and capable, began to tremble. Her knuckles were white. The muscles in her arms screamed in protest, but she could not move. She was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her inaction. The noise of the inn, the frantic shouts and weeping, started to bleed back into her awareness. She saw a young boy, no older than 10, clinging to his father's leg, his face streaked with tears, his eyes wide with a terror he did not fully understand. She saw the blacksmith, a man of immense physical strength, slump onto a bench, his powerful shoulders shaking. She saw the fear, raw and absolute, that had now infected every corner of her small, safe world. Her hiding had protected no one. It had only delayed the inevitable chaos. And then, her strength gave out. The tray tilted. The stack of earthenware mugs slid, a slow-motion cascade of failure. They struck the floorboards not with a single crash, but with a series of sharp, splintering cracks. The sound was surprisingly loud. A percussive, violent interruption to the human din. One moment they were whole. The next, they were 100 jagged pieces of brown clay scattered at her feet. The sound shattered her paralysis. Every head in the inn turned towards her. For a heartbeat, the panic subsided, replaced by unified, startled attention. They saw a simple serving girl, standing amidst the ruins of her dropped crockery, her face unreadable. They saw a minor, clumsy accident in the midst of a national tragedy. But Alara was no longer there. The breaking of the mugs had broken something inside her, too. The fear, the guilt, the suffocating weight of her mother's warning, it all cracked open. And from those cracks, something new and hard and fiercely bright began to pour out. She did not look at the shattered pieces on the floor. She did not look at the stunned faces of the patrons. She lifted her head and her eyes went past them all, through the grimy glass of the inn's front window, towards the distant, imposing silhouette of Silver Spire Keep. The keep stood against the twilight sky, a tower of dark stone and flickering torchlight. To the others, it was now a tomb, the symbol of their loss. To Alara, it was a challenge. Her breath came back to her in a single shuddering gasp. It was not a gasp of sorrow, but of cold, stark purpose. The fear was still there, a knot of ice deep in her belly, but it was no longer her master. It was fuel. Her mother's warning echoed again, but this time the words meant something different, a light that draws shadows. Her mother had never told her to extinguish the light. She had only warned her of the pain of letting it shine. It was a bastos she was now willing to pay. The timid, unassuming girl who had spent her life trying to be invisible was gone. In her place stood someone else. Her jaw hardened. Her gray eyes, usually so placid and observant, narrowed with an intensity that would have startled anyone close enough to see it. The king might be gone. It might be too late. But the curse that had taken him was not. It was a living, hungry thing. And she was a hunter of such things. She had been trained for this since she was a child. The bell was not an ending. It was a beginning. Alara, Giles's voice was gentle, concerned. Are you all right, child? Never mind the mugs. She did not answer him. She did not even seem to hear him. With a fluid grace that seemed impossible for a clumsy serving girl, she turned from the wreckage at her feet. She moved through the chaotic tavern as if she were walking through water. Patrons, still reeling from the news, instinctively moved aside for her, their own anxieties momentarily forgotten as they watched her silent, determined passage. She walked past the weeping woman, past the arguing merchants, past the terrified child. Their world was falling apart. Hers had just snapped into focus. She pushed through the door that led to the small private corridor for the inn staff. The noise of the common room was instantly muffled, replaced by the quiet hum of her own pulse in her ears. Her footsteps were quick and sure on the worn floorboards. She reached the door to her room, a small, cramped space tucked away at the back of the building. It was barely large enough for a narrow cot, a small wooden chest, and a rickety washstand. It was a room designed for someone who wished to go unnoticed. It had been her sanctuary. Now it felt like a cage she was about to escape. She did not hesitate. She crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before the small wooden chest. Her hands did not tremble now. They were firm, purposeful. She lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a neatly folded spare tunic and a small bundle of dried herbs, was the locket. The moon petal locket was cool to the touch. The silver was tarnished with age. The chain a simple, sturdy cord of dark leather. It was not a piece of fine jewelry. It was a tool, an inheritance, a promise. She lifted it from the chest, its weight familiar and grounding in her palm. For her entire life, this object had been a secret, a heavy truth she kept hidden beneath layers of cloth and fear. To wear it openly was to declare herself, to invite the very danger her mother had spent a lifetime teaching her to avoid. She stood up. The muffled sounds of panic still leaked through the thin walls, a reminder of the world she was about to step into. She held the locket for a moment longer, the smooth metal pressing into her skin. Then, with a decisive movement, she brought it up and settled the leather cord around her neck. She did not tuck it beneath her collar. She let it fall, a silver teardrop against the simple brown fabric of her tunic. It rested against her collarbone, a visible, defiant proclamation. The choice was made. The hesitation was ash. The servant girl was gone and the healer was ready. The locket felt like a stone of ice against her skin. Elara stood in the cramped stillness of her attic room, the floorboards vibrating with the chaos from the tavern below. Shouts and the crash of a dropped chair bled through the wood, a muffled soundtrack to the silent tremor in her hands. She drew a ragged breath, the air tasting of dust and dried herbs. Her fingers traced the cool, unfamiliar weight of the moon petal locket, now resting over her heart instead of hidden beneath layers of linen. It was no longer a secret, it was a declaration. Her mother's warning swirled in her mind, a frantic chorus of fear and caution, a light that draws shadows, men of power, men of dogma. But the mournful toll of that single bell had silenced them all. It was not a sound of death. It was a sound of failure. A kingdom giving up. Her resolve was a fragile newborn thing. It needed to be shielded, to be acted upon before her own terror could extinguish it. She took one last look around the tiny room that had been her entire world. The narrow cot, the small crate with her few spare clothes, the sprigs of lavender and yarrow tied to the rafters. A life of quiet invisibility, a life she was about to burn to the ground. She forced her legs to move, pulling open the door and stepping onto the narrow landing. The noise from the common room hit her like a physical blow. She descended the creaking stairs, each step taking her further from the girl she had been just an hour ago. The weary wanderer was a scene of controlled panic. Patrons huddled in tight groups, whispering in frightened tones. Giles, the innkeeper, his face pale and sweating, was trying to calm a merchant who was shouting about his wares being stranded in the city. Elara moved along the wall, a ghost in her own home, her eyes fixed on Giles. She needed to speak to him, to give him a reason for her departure that would not bring questions she could not answer. It was her first lie in a chain that already felt heavy enough to drown her. She reached his side and waited, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He finally turned, his gaze distracted and fraught with worry. When he saw her, his expression softened for a fraction of a second. Elara, not you two. Stay away from the windows. There's a madness in the streets tonight. His voice was hoarse. He thought she was just another frightened girl seeking reassurance. The thought sent a pang of guilt through her. Giles, she said, her own voice barely a whisper. She had to force the words out. I have to go out. His brow furrowed in disbelief. Out? Are you mad, girl? Did you not hear the bell? The king is gone. There will be riots. The guard will be stretched thin. It's the safest place in here." He gestured vaguely to the chaotic room. "It might not be safe, but it is safer than out there." Alara shook her head, her gaze steady despite the frantic pounding in her chest. "One of the guards at the east gate, Thomas. His wife came to me last week. His shoulder wound from the practice yard is festering." This was the half-truth. Thomas was real. His wound was real. She had given his wife a simple poultice of comfrey and marigold. "I made a stronger balm. With the city in this state, he will be on duty all night. The infection could take his arm if it's not seen to." It sounded plausible. It sounded like her. The quiet, helpful girl who knew her herbs. Giles stared at her, his mind clearly torn between the immediate crisis in his inn and the welfare of the girl he had watched grow up. He saw the small satchel she now wore over her shoulder, a bag she usually only used for foraging in the nearby woods. "A poultice," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the word. "For a guard. Tonight." "He needs it," Alara insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "It will only take a moment. I know the back ways." He sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of the whole kingdom. "You have your mother's stubborn heart. You know that? She never could abide leaving a hurt untended, no matter the risk." He reached out and placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Be quick, quicker than a shadow. Do not speak to anyone. If any of the city watch stops you, you tell them Giles of the Wanderer sent you on an urgent errand. They know me." "I will," she promised, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. This was her farewell. He would not see her again. He would eventually learn that she never went to the East Gate, that Thomas the guard was not her destination. He would wonder, and then he would likely assume the worst, that she had been lost in the night's chaos. The thought was another sharp pain, another piece of her old life she had to sever and leave behind. "Go on then," he said, turning back to the shouting merchant. "And may the gods watch over you, child." She didn't wait for him to change his mind. She turned and slipped away, not towards the main entrance, but towards the back. She moved through the kitchen, a space she knew better than her own hands. The air was thick with the comforting smells of baking bread and spilled ale. Two kitchen hands were huddled by the cold hearth, their faces white with fear. They didn't even notice her pass. She pushed open the heavy wooden door to the storeroom. The familiar scent of grain, smoked meats, and damp earth filled her lungs. She navigated the narrow path between barrels of cider and sacks of potatoes, her feet silent on the stone floor. This was the final threshold. Beyond the back door was a world that did not know her, a world that would hunt her if it ever discovered what she was. Her hand rested on the iron latch. It was cold and solid. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. She could still turn back. She could return to the kitchen, claim the streets were too dangerous, and retreat to her attic room. She could hide the locket again and let the king die. The kingdom would fall. The cold, hungry magic of the curse would spread, and she would spend the rest of her life polishing tankards, haunted by the ghost of the choice she did not make. Her fingers tightened on the latch. She pulled. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a narrow, rain-slicked alley. The sounds of the inn vanished, replaced by the city's chorus of fear. A woman was sobbing somewhere nearby. A man shouted, his voice sharp with authority, and underneath it all, the phantom echo of that single terrible bell. Alara slipped out into the darkness and pulled the door shut behind her, the click of the latch sounding as final as a tomb ceiling. The air was cold and damp, carrying the stench of wet refuse and fear. She was alone. The dim light from a distant torch cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to claw at the edges of her vision. She pulled her cloak tighter and began to run. She kept to the warren of alleys she knew from childhood, a secret map etched into her memory. Her boots splashed through murky puddles, the sounds swallowed by the night's clamor. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep behind her. Her mother's voice was a constant whisper now. "They will not understand this magic, Alara. They will call it profane. They will fear what they cannot control, and they will destroy it." She pressed a hand over the locket, the metal a point of focus in the swirling storm of her fear. But another feeling was growing stronger now, a strange and terrible compass needle pulling her forward. It was the curse. She could feel it more clearly out here, away from the warmth and noise of the inn. It was a cold spot in the world, a void of life and warmth emanating from the great stone peak of Silverspire Keep. The keep loomed over the city, a jagged black silhouette against a sky the color of an old bruise. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was the source of the sickness. She darted across a wider street, pressing herself into the shadows of a shuttered bakery. A patrol of the city watch marched past, their lantern lights sweeping across the cobblestones. Their faces were grim, their spears held ready. They were looking for rioters and looters, not for a slip of a girl on an impossible mission. She waited until their footsteps faded, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. What was she going to do when she got there? Walk up to the gate and announce she was here to heal the king? They would laugh at her before they threw her in a cell for a madwoman. The thought almost made her stop. This was insane. She was a tavern maid with a secret she barely understood herself. Master Valerius, the royal physician, with all his knowledge and authority, had failed. The greatest healers in the kingdom had failed. What could she possibly do? Then she remembered her dream. The creeping, thorny vines of black magic, twisting around a fading light. She remembered the visceral feeling of the curse, a hunger that fed on life itself. Conventional healing was like trying to patch a leaking bucket while someone was actively punching more holes in it. They were treating the wound. They were not treating the magic. Her ancestors had not fought infection or set bones with their gift. They had fought darkness. They had tended to wounds of the soul, to curses that clung like poison ivy to the spirit. Her magic was not for the body. It was for the light that the body housed. A surge of purpose, sharp and clear, cut through her fear. She knew something they did not. That was her only weapon. She pushed off from the wall and continued her journey, her steps more certain now. She moved through the poorer quarters that huddled at the base of the keep's hill. Here, the fear was sharper, more desperate. Faces peered from behind grimy windows, their eyes wide. The smell of poverty was thick in the air, a mix of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and cheap gin. The ascent to the keep was steep. The alleys gave way to a wide, winding road paved with smooth gray stones. The homes here were larger, their walls higher, their windows dark and empty. The silence on this road was more unnerving than the chaos below. It was the silence of held breath, of a wealthy class waiting to see which way the axe would fall. The keep grew with every step, its stone walls seeming to drink the very light from the sky. It was a fortress built to repel armies, a symbol of unbreachable power. And she was going to walk right through its gates. She could feel the curse pulsing more strongly now, a nauseating thrum against her senses. It was a cold, malevolent presence, and it was aware. She felt a flicker of something brush against her mind, a cold inquiry. The magic in the wound was alive, and it sensed her light approaching. She instinctively clutched the locket, its faint warmth a shield against the probing cold. The presence recoiled, like a slug touched by salt. Terror and exhilaration warred within her. She was walking into the heart of the shadow, and it knew she was coming. Finally, she rounded the last bend in the road. Before her lay the vast, open plaza that fronted the main gate of Silverspire Keep. Her desperate run had come to an end. The plaza was not empty. A large crowd was pressed against a line of guards, a motley collection of desperate citizens, opportunistic charlatans, and genuine herbalists who had come hoping to claim the now useless reward. Their voices rose in a confused babble of pleas, demands, and prayers. But the line of guards was impassable. There were dozens of them, clad in the silver and black of the royal guard. Their polished helmets reflected the flickering torchlight, their faces set like stone. Their spears formed a glittering wall of sharpened steel. The main gate behind them, a colossal structure of iron-banded oak, was shut fast. A heavy bar, thick as a man's waist, was drawn across it. Alara slowed to a walk, her breath catching in her throat. She skirted the edge of the crowd, her smaller size allowing her to weave through the crush of bodies until she could see the gate clearly. A portly merchant in fine but disheveled robes was attempting to bribe the captain of the guard. 100 gold royals, he was saying, his voice slick with sweat. Just to let me see him. I have a relic from the Southern Isles. It is said to cure any ailment. The captain did not even glance at the pouch of coins. The keep is sealed by order of the Queen Regent, he said, his voice flat and exhausted. No one enters. No one leaves. Now move back before my men move you. He shoved the merchant, who stumbled backward into the crowd with a squeal of indignation. A young woman near the front fell to her knees weeping. Please, my lords, she cried out. Let me through. I am a water fetcher. I saw the king at the summer fair. He smiled at me. I just want to pray for him. A guard nudged her with the butt of his spear. Pray from here, he grunted, his expression empty of pity. Alara watched, a cold dread seeping into her bones. This was not a barrier she could talk her way through. This was not a problem her resolve could solve. This was a wall of steel and royal decree. Her desperate flight through the city, the wastes, the fear she had overcome, it had all been for nothing. She had reached her destination only to find the door locked, barred, and guarded by men who would run her through without a second thought. The purpose that had burned so brightly within her just moments before me now flickered and dimmed. She was just a girl standing in a crowd of nobodies, staring at a closed gate. The king was dying just a few hundred yards away, and she was as helpless to reach him as if she were on the other side of the world. The iron-banded gates of Silver Spire Keep were a wall of absolute refusal. Two guards, their faces impassive beneath steel helmets, stood before them like statues. They held their polearms crossed, a silent, unbreachable barrier. The crowd of hopefuls and charlatans had thinned, replaced by a desperate, watching silence from the townsfolk kept at a distance. Alara stood among them, the cold night air doing little to cool the fire in her chest. For every step she had taken from the inn, a wall of impossibility now rose before her. Her resolve, so fierce and sudden just moments ago, felt like a fragile glass bird beating its wings against granite. One of the guards, a man with a thick graying mustache, shook his head at a richly dressed merchant. The keep is sealed by royal decree. No one enters. His voice was flat, worn out from repeating the same command for hours. Alara watched the merchant argue, his hands gesturing wildly before he was forced to retreat in a flurry of expensive silks and muttered curses. Her own simple dress and calloused hands would earn her even less consideration. She was invisible, a servant girl with an impossible task. Despair, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her determination. She had been a fool to think she could just walk in. She backed away from the gate, melting into the deeper shadows clinging to the town's outer walls. The keep loomed over her, a mountain of dark stone that seemed to drink the moonlight. It was a fortress designed to keep people out, and it was doing its job perfectly. Her mind raced, sifting through desperate, useless ideas. Could she bribe a guard? She had only a few copper coins to her name. Could she climb the walls? They were sheer, smooth, and impossibly high. The locket beneath her tunic felt heavy, a dead weight of failed purpose. Then a memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. It was not of her mother's gentle lessons on herbs, but of her father. Her father, Thomas, a stonemason with hands as rough as the rocks he shaped. He had worked on the keep's foundations years ago, before a fall from a scaffold had weakened his lungs and forced him into an early grave. He used to come home covered in stone dust, smelling of earth and sweat. He would unroll vast, crinkling parchments on their small wooden table, maps and plans of the keep's construction. As a child, she had been fascinated by the intricate lines, the secret passages for servants, the channels for water, the bones of the great stone beast. Every castle has its secrets, Alara, he had told her once, his finger tracing a faint blue line near the base of the western wall. It breathes, it drinks, and it gets rid of its waste. A fortress is like a body. If you know where the veins are, you can always find a way in. The memory struck her with the force of a physical blow. The veins, the drainage channels. She scanned the immense base of the keep, her eyes tracing the line where the colossal stone met the damp earth. The main gate was on the eastern side, facing the town. The western side, her father had explained, was built against a natural decline, where rainwater and waste would be funneled away from the main structure. It was a long shot, a child's memory of a dusty old map. But it was the only shot she had. Keeping to the shadows, Alara began to circle the massive curtain wall. The ground grew soft and marshy under her worn leather shoes. The air grew thick with the smell of damp soil and decay. She stumbled through thickets of thorny bushes that clawed at her clothes and skin, but she barely noticed. Her father's words echoed in her mind, a guiding voice from a life she thought she had left behind. She was no longer just a healer's daughter. She was a stonemason's daughter, too. And that knowledge might be what saved the king. She found it tucked behind a curtain of thick, overgrown ivy, almost completely hidden from view. It was a drainage culvert, just as she remembered. The arched opening was framed with heavy, moss-covered stones, many of which had shifted or fallen over the years. The passage was not much wider than her shoulders, a dark, uninviting maw that smelled of stagnant water and something fouler. A rusty iron grate that should have barred the entrance was broken, its bars bent and twisted outward as if by some great pressure from within. It was just large enough for a person to squeeze through, a very determined person. For a moment she hesitated. The darkness inside was absolute. The thought of rats, of getting stuck, of the unknown filth within made her stomach churn. Her mother's warning about drawing shadows with her light felt chillingly real. Here she was, about to crawl into the literal underbelly of the kingdom's power. She took a deep breath, the foul air catching in her throat, and thought of the king. She imagined the creeping black veins of the curse, a slow, relentless poison. She thought of the bell tolling, of the chaos in the inn, of the kingdom tearing itself apart. Her fear was a small thing compared to that. She tucked her skirt up, hitched her leg over the collapsed stonework, and slid into the opening. The cold was immediate, a shocking, wet chill that seeped through her clothes. The stone was slick with slime, and she had to brace her hands against the rough walls to keep from falling face first into the shallow stream of refuse flowing at the bottom. The smell was overpowering, a gagging mixture of sewage and rot. She forced herself to breathe through her mouth, tasting the filth on her tongue. The tunnel was even narrower than it looked. She had to turn sideways, shuffling forward inch by painful inch. Darkness enveloped her completely. She could hear nothing but the dripping of water, the scuttling of unseen things, and the frantic pounding of her own heart. The leather cord of the locket was slick against her skin, a single point of focus in the suffocating black. She held on to the image of its pure, silvery light, a charm against the oppressive dark. A sharp edge of stone caught her skirt, tearing the simple homespun fabric from hem to knee. The sound was loud in the confined space. She didn't flinch. That dress, that life, was already gone. She was someone else now. Someone who crawled through filth to defy death. With every shuffling step, she felt as if she were shedding her old self, leaving the timid tavern maid behind in the muck and slime. The girl who polished tankards and avoided eye contact could never have done this. Her hands, already calloused from work, were scraped raw against the unforgiving stone. Her hair, which had come loose from its simple tie, was matted with grime. She felt something brush against her leg, and she bit back a scream, kicking out into the darkness. It was just a clump of debris, washed along by the sluggish current. She pressed on, her lungs burning, her body trembling with cold and exertion. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a black, endless throat. Just as she began to think she had made a terrible mistake, that the tunnel was a dead end, she saw it, a faint sliver of light far ahead. It was a pale, flickering orange, the color of torchlight. Hope surged through her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She moved faster, ignoring the pain in her scraped hands and the tearing of her muscles. The light grew, and with it came a cacophony of new sounds. The clang of metal, the shouting of voices, the hiss of cooking. The tunnel ended abruptly at another iron grate, this one intact but not locked. It was heavy, but her desperation gave her strength. Gritting her teeth, she pushed. It groaned in protest, the sound of rusting metal scraping against stone echoing back down the tunnel. She pushed harder, her muscles screaming. With a final shuddering screech, it swung inward. Alara tumbled out onto a cold, greasy stone floor, landing in a heap of torn cloth and grime. She blinked, her eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden brightness. She was in a vast, cavernous kitchen, a scullery by the looks of it. The air was thick with the steam from enormous copper pots, the smell of roasting meat, onions, and wood smoke. Dozens of people rushed about, servants in grease-stained aprons, cooks with flushed, sweaty faces. The noise was deafening. It was the frantic, controlled chaos of a royal kitchen preparing a feast, or perhaps simply feeding a castle in crisis. She had emerged behind a stack of empty barrels, momentarily hidden from view. She pushed her filthy hair from her face, trying to get her bearings. She was a mess, covered in filth, her dress torn. She looked like a beggar who had crawled out of a sewer, which was precisely what she was. Anyone who saw her would raise the alarm instantly. Her luck ran out. A young boy, no older than 15, rounded the barrels carrying a heavy wooden bucket. He stopped dead, his eyes widening in shock as he took in her state. His mouth opened, a gasp forming, the prelude to a shout that would bring the whole kitchen, and likely the castle guards, down on her. There was no time for pleading, no time for explanations. In that split second, Alara's fear burned away, replaced by a cold, hard focus she didn't know she possessed. She surged to her feet and closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides. Before he could make a sound, she grabbed the front of his tunic with one filthy hand. Her other hand went up, not to strike him, but in a gesture of silencing. She met his terrified gaze and poured all of her will, all of her desperation, into her own. Her voice, when it came, was not the soft tone of a serving girl. It was a low, urgent hiss, raw with authority. "Don't scream," she commanded. The boy froze, the bucket slipping from his grasp and landing with a hollow thud. His eyes were wide with fear, not just of her sudden appearance, but of the terrifying intensity in her face. "I need to get to the king's chambers," she said, her grip still tight on his shirt. She saw the flicker of understanding, and even more fear, in his eyes. Everyone in the keep knew what was happening in those chambers. "Please," she added, and the single word was not a command, but a genuine plea. The hardness in her eyes softened for a fraction of a second, revealing the crushing weight of her purpose. It was a plea for help, for a life that was not her own. "There is no time." The kitchen boy stared at her. He saw the filth and the torn dress, but he also saw the raw desperation, the unwavering conviction in her gray eyes. He saw a terror that dwarfed his own. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He was just a kitchen boy. Getting involved could mean a flogging, or worse. But turning her in felt wrong, like betraying something important. Even if he didn't understand what it was. He gave a short, jerky nod. Ilara released him, her hand falling away. The boy, whose name was probably Thomas, or Sam, or something equally common, seemed to deflate with relief. Without a word, he gestured for her to follow, picking up his bucket and moving with a renewed sense of purpose. He led her away from the main kitchen, down a narrow, winding corridor used by servants. They passed pantries stacked high with sacks of flour and wine cellars thick with the scent of old wood and spilled vintages. The sounds of the kitchen faded, replaced by the hushed quiet of the keep's inner passages. They climbed yet flight after flight of narrow stone stairs, spiraling upwards into the heart of the castle. The air grew cleaner, cooler. The rough stone walls gave way to smoother, dressed stone, and then to walls hung with faded tapestries depicting hunts and battles. They moved like ghosts in the arteries of the keep, Ilara a shadow of filth and desperation trailing a terrified boy. He glanced back at her every few moments, as if to make sure she was real. Finally, he stopped. They had emerged into a wide, grand corridor. The floor was polished marble, reflecting the flickering light of ornate iron sconces. 2 guards in the gleaming silver and black of the royal guard stood at attention before a set of massive oak doors at the far end of the hall. Their faces were grim, their posture rigid. This was it. The air here was heavy, still, and thick with a palpable sense of dread. The faint, cloying smell of medicinal herbs and incense did little to mask an underlying metallic tang of blood. The kitchen boy pointed a trembling finger toward the doors. "The royal chambers," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He looked at her, his duty done, his eyes begging to be released. Ilara gave him a small, grateful nod, and he practically vanished, scurrying back down the servants' passage as if hunted. She was alone, alone in the lion's den, standing outside the very center of the kingdom's pain. She took a hesitant step forward, her bare feet cold on the marble. As she drew closer to the doors, she could hear a voice from within. It was a man's voice, raised not in anger, but in sheer utter frustration. It cracked with the strain of sleepless nights and the bitterness of failure. It was a voice she recognized from the inn, the voice of Master Valerius. And what she heard him say froze the blood in her veins. It was the sound of a proud man admitting his own defeat, the sound of hope dying. She stood there, a filthy girl in a torn dress, listening to the most powerful healer in the kingdom give up. The faint, terrified patter of the kitchen boy's footsteps faded down the stone corridor door, leaving Alara in an unnerving silence. Before her stood two colossal oak doors, banded with black iron. From behind them a voice drifted, thin and strained with exhaustion, yet sharp with the edge of command. It was the voice of Master Valerius, and it carried the bitter finality of a death sentence. Her hand, trembling slightly, rested on the cold, ornate ring of the door-pull. The metal was frigid, leaching warmth from her skin, a stark reminder of the keep's chilling despair. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to flee into the familiar shadows of the scullery and the winding alleys of the town. Her mother's warnings echoed in her mind, a frantic chorus of fear and caution. Men of power, men of dogma, they would not understand her gift. They would twist it, name it something dark, and destroy her for it. But then, through the thick wood, she felt it, a cold, parasitic presence that pulsed like a diseased heart. It was the same corrupting magic from her nightmares, but 100 times stronger now, suffocating the very air. It was a vile, hungry thing, and it was feeding on the life of a man she had never met. The locket hidden beneath her simple tunic grew warmer against her sternum, a single point of gentle heat in a world gone cold. It was not a demand. It was a reminder of who she was, of the knowledge her mother had passed down not as a warning, but as a duty. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that did little to calm the frantic drumming in her chest, Alara closed her eyes for a heartbeat. She was not a warrior. She was not a noble lady. She was a tavern servant with calloused hands and a secret that could get her burned. But she was also a healer, and a man was dying. Her fingers tightened around the iron ring and she pushed. The heavy door groaned on its hinges, the sound unnaturally loud, a desecration of the tomb-like quiet on the other side. The room that opened before her was vast and cold, a cavern of shadows and flickering candlelight. The air was thick, almost unbreathable, a sickening mix of cloying medicinal incense, hot wax, and something else. An underlying metallic tang that she knew instantly was the smell of old blood, layered with the scent of decay, like damp soil and withered leaves. Huge tapestries depicting glorious, sun-drenched battles hung on the stone walls, their vibrant threads a mockery of the gloom they failed to dispel. In the center of the room, a massive canopy bed stood like a royal bier. It was there that the source of the room's cold despair lay. King Theron was little more than a pale outline against the dark velvet sheets. His skin, stretched taut over the sharp angles of his face, held a waxy, unnatural pallor. Sweat matted his dark hair to his temples, and his powerful chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths that were barely visible. Even from the doorway, Alara could see the corruption. A web of black veins spread from the thick bandages on his side, crawling up his torso and neck, like dark ivy strangling a white marble statue. The magic was visible, a creeping blight that consumed him from within. Around the bed stood a small, defeated congregation. An older woman with silver-streaked hair, her face a mask of regal sorrow, stood with one hand gripping the bedpost. Her knuckles were white, her posture rigid with a grief too profound for tears. The Queen Regent. Beside her, Master Valerius stood with his back to the door, his shoulders slumped. His immaculate physician's robes seemed to hang off his thin frame, his usual arrogance replaced by the hollow posture of failure. He spoke to the Queen, his voice cracking with the strain. "There is nothing more to be done, Your Majesty." Each word was a tiny shard of glass, sharp and painful. "We have tried every poultice, every incantation known to the conclave. The shard of sorrow's kiss is too deep, its magic too strong." He gestured with a trembling hand toward a silver tray cluttered with bloodied instruments and discarded herbs. His life force is nearly gone. All we can do now is make him comfortable. As he finished speaking, two royal guards near the door turned, their eyes widening at the sight of Alara. Their faces were grim, etched with exhaustion and fear. Seeing her simple, torn dress and dirt-streaked face, their expressions hardened into pure contempt. She was an intrusion, a speck of common dust in this sacred, somber space. "Out!" one of them barked, his voice a low growl. He started towards her, his gauntleted hand reaching for her arm. "This is no place for serving girls. Get out now." The other guard moved to block the doorway behind her, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. Their movements were swift, automatic, born of years spent securing royal spaces from the unworthy. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's resolve. Her legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. They saw a girl who had wandered out of her station. They would grab her, throw her out, and she would have failed before she even began. Her throat went dry. The guard's fingers were about to close around her arm, his touch sure to be bruising, dismissive. She could feel the heat of his anger, the weary frustration of a man watching his king die, now forced to deal with a foolish commoner. In that split second, she looked past the guard's angry face, her gaze locking once more on the dying man in the bed. She saw the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand, the struggle for a single shallow breath. The healer in her rose up, a fierce, protective wave that drowned her fear in its tide. This was not about her. It was not about her mother's warnings or her own terror. It was about the life slipping away in that bed. Her voice, when it came, was not the timid whisper of a servant. It was clear and steady, cutting through the heavy air with an authority that stunned the approaching guard into stillness. It was the voice she used when tending to a feverish child or setting a broken bone, a voice that carried an ancient, certain knowledge. Every head in the room snapped toward her. The Queen Regent's eyes, red-rimmed and distant, focused on her with faint surprise. Master Valerius spun around, his face a mask of disbelief and indignation. The guard's hand froze, inches from her shoulder. They all stared at the slip of a girl in a dirty dress who had dared to speak in the king's death chamber. Alara met Valerius's gaze directly, her own gray eyes unwavering. She did not look at the queen or the guards or the opulent dying room. She looked at the man who had pronounced the king's doom, the master of a knowledge that had proven useless. "The curse is not just strong," Alara said, her voice ringing with a truth that silenced the entire chamber. "It is hungry." The silence that followed her words was heavier than any stone in the keep. It was a dense, suffocating thing, pressing down on the shoulders of lords and ladies, guards and physicians alike. The two men who had lunged for her remained frozen in place, their hands hovering uselessly in the air between them and the strange serving girl who spoke of curses as if she knew them. Their faces were a perfect picture of confusion, their training telling them to eject the intruder, but some new, unknown instinct screaming at them to wait. Master Valerius's face, already pale with failure, contorted into a mask of pure indignation. "Hungry?" he spat, his voice a venomous whisper that failed to carry its usual weight. "You speak of ancient evils as if you are reciting a tavern tale. Guards, remove this hysterical child at once. She pollutes the very air the king must breathe." But Alara did not hear him, or if she did, she paid him no mind. Her world had narrowed to the vast canopied bed and the broken man lying upon it. The cloying scent of blood and herbal smoke was a physical presence, something she had to push through with every step. In her mind, she could hear her mother's voice, a distant echo from a childhood spent in sun-dappled clearings. "The magic is a light, my love, and light does not ask for permission to shine." She took a step forward. The sound of her worn leather shoe on the polished marble floor was unnervingly loud. Then another step. She ignored the rustle of silk as nobles shifted uncomfortably. She ignored the glint of steel as the guards' eyes darted toward their captain, seeking an order that did not come. Her own gaze was fixed on King Theron. She saw not a king, but a man being devoured from the inside out. The dark magic emanating from his wound was a tangible thing to her senses, a cold, oily slick that coated every surface in the room, a palpable aura of decay that made her teeth ache. She reached the bedside. The sheets were a mess of sweat-soaked linen and dark, spreading stains of red. King Theron's chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged movements that were barely breaths at all. His skin was waxy, his handsome features sharpened by pain into a grim parody of life. Black spidery veins crept from beneath the stained bandages on his side, branching out across his torso like a dead tree in winter. They seemed to pulse with a faint, unholy rhythm of their own. "Get away from him," Valerius commanded, taking a step forward himself, his pristine robes sweeping across the floor. Alara did not even look at him. Her purpose was a shield, deflecting his anger and his fear. Her calloused fingers, so used to scrubbing pots and carrying tankards, moved with a grace no one in that room had ever seen. She reached for the simple leather cord around her neck, pulling it from beneath the collar of her drab tunic. Hanging from it was a small, tarnished silver locket, shaped like a closed flower. It looked like a common enough trinket, a peasant's heirloom worth less than a single button on Valerius's coat. "A bauble," the physician scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "You dare to bring this peasant superstition into the royal chamber? This is beyond insolence. This is madness." Alara's thumb found the tiny hidden clasp. For a heartbeat, the faces of all the women in her line flashed before her eyes. Her mother, her grandmother, and generations before them, all keepers of a fading light. They had hidden. They had lived in fear. They had died with their secrets safe. Alara took a deep breath, the foul air of the sick room filling her lungs, and made a different choice. She pressed the clasp. The locket clicked open. It did not explode with light. It did not create a blinding flash. Instead, a soft, pure luminescence bloomed from within, a silvery white glow as gentle as moonlight on fresh snow. Yet this gentle light had an incredible force. The oppressive, shadowy aura clinging to the king recoiled as if struck. The visible shimmer of dark energy around the wound seemed to hiss, retreating from the locket's glow like a frightened animal. The suffocating gloom in the room did not vanish, but it was pushed back, creating a small, sanctified circle of clarity around the bed. The physician stopped dead, his mouth falling slightly open. The guards lowered their hands completely, their eyes wide with a dawning, fearful awe. Across the room, the Queen Regent took a half step forward, her hand pressed against her heart. Alara paid them no notice. The light from the petal inside the locket shone on her face, illuminating the fierce concentration in her gray eyes. She held the open locket in one hand, a beacon against the encroaching night. With her other hand, she reached out, not to touch the king's feverish skin, but to hover her palm a few inches above the ghastly wound. She could feel the curse's hunger now, a malevolent intelligence pulling at the life force of the man beneath her hand, a vortex of cold and despair. She closed her eyes and began to chant. The words were not of any tongue spoken in the kingdom. They were older, formed from the language of starlight and growing things, of life's fierce refusal to yield to darkness. The sound was low, almost a hum at first, a resonant vibration that seemed to originate not in her throat, but in her very bones. It was a melody of wholeness, a song of mending. As she chanted, the silver light from the locket pulsed in time with her voice. With every ancient syllable, the light flowed from the locket, down her arm, and through her waiting palm. It poured into the space above the wound, a liquid stream of pure, cleansing energy. For a moment, nothing happened. The black veins on Theron's skin seemed to mock her efforts, pulsing defiantly. Valerius let out a short, sharp breath, almost a laugh of vindication. But then it began. One of the creeping black tendrils, the one reaching furthest across the king's chest, hesitated. It flickered like a candle flame in a draft. Then, with an agonizing slowness, it began to retreat. It pulled back, shrinking millimeter by millimeter toward the source of the corruption. Another vein followed, and then another. The hideous web of death was unraveling. The steady, horrifying trickle of blood that had defeated every poultice and bandage Valerius had applied began to change. It slowed, it thickened. The dark red turned to a healthier crimson. And then, as Alara's chant reached a soft, sustained crescendo, the bleeding stopped completely. For the first time in weeks, the white linen around the king's wound was not growing darker. The silence in the room was now one of profound shock. Master Valerius stood as if turned to stone, his entire life's work, his books, his lectures, his unshakable belief in his own craft, crumbling to dust before his eyes. He stared at the receding veins, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. This was not medicine. This was not science. This was something else entirely, something ancient and powerful that his dogma had no words for. Alara's voice faded, the last note of the chant hanging in the air like a silver bell before dissolving into nothing. She swayed on her feet, the effort draining her completely. The light from her locket softened, returning to a gentle, constant glow. The circle of pure air remained. The only sound in the vast chamber was the king's breathing. It was no longer the shallow gasp of a dying man. It was deeper, steadier, even. Each breath was a quiet miracle, a testament to the impossible act that had just transpired. A single collective gasp rippled through the stunned onlookers. It was a sound of disbelief, of wonder, of a hope they had all thought extinguished. And then the king's eyelids fluttered. They were heavy, as if he were fighting his way up from the bottom of a deep, dark ocean. With a shuddering effort, they opened. His piercing blue eyes, no longer clouded by the fog of agony and fever, were startlingly clear. They were filled with a raw, weary confusion. His gaze swept blankly past the ornate tapestries, past the worried face of his mother, past the stunned figure of his royal physician. His eyes moved past the armored guards standing like statues. Then they found her. They found the plainly dressed girl with calloused hands and tired, serious gray eyes, who stood beside his bed holding a small, silver light. King Theron's gaze locked onto Alara's. In that instant, the vast, cold room and everyone in it seemed to melt away, leaving only the two of them, a dying king and the impossible girl who had just refused to let him go. The gasp hung in the air, a ghost of sound in a room that had suddenly become a tomb of silence. Only one thing moved, one thing made a noise: the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of King Theron's chest. It was a sound no one in that chamber had heard for days, a sound of life, not of struggle. Alara's hands, still trembling from the torrent of energy she had unleashed, hovered over the wound. The locket, its duty done, had dimmed to a soft, pulsing silver glow against her palm, its light no longer fighting a tide of darkness, but simply resting. Theron's eyes were fixed on her, not with the delirious haze of fever, but with a startling, sharp clarity. It was as if he had been pulled from the bottom of a deep, dark lake and was seeing the sun for the first time. He saw a plain girl with tired gray eyes and calloused hands. He saw the faint sheen of sweat on her brow. He saw the tarnished silver locket she clutched as if it were the only anchor in the world. And in his gaze there was no recognition of a servant, no dismissal. There was only raw, unfiltered awe. The moment stretched, fragile as spun glass. Then, a sharp intake of breath shattered it. Master Valerius took a single stiff step forward. His face was a battlefield of warring emotions. Disbelief was the first wave, his mind refusing to process what his eyes had just witnessed. He, the royal physician, with all the accumulated knowledge of the great academies, with herbs worth a farmer's entire estate, had failed. He had pronounced the king's decline unstoppable. He had prepared the queen regent for the inevitable. And this girl, had undone it all with a trinket and a whispered chant. His jaw worked silently. For a moment, a flicker of pure academic wonder crossed his features. The magic had been undeniable. It was a force of nature he had only read about in forbidden texts, a power he had dismissed as folk tales. But that flicker of wonder was quickly poisoned. Humiliation followed, hot and acidic. The eyes of the court, which had looked to him with desperate hope, were now fixed on a tavern maid. His entire legacy, his reputation built over decades of service, had just crumbled into dust at her feet. Jealousy, cold and sharp, was the final victor. He looked from his own clean, manicured hands, which had trembled with helplessness, to Alara's, which had glowed with impossible power. "What trickery is this?" Valerius's voice was a harsh croak, a desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative. He tried to project authority, but the tremor in his tone betrayed him. Some parlor magic? A flash of light to distract from a cheap poultice? No one answered him. No one even looked at him. Their attention was a physical weight on Alara. The two guards who had moved to seize her were frozen in place. Their swords were no longer raised to strike, but they were not sheathed either. They held them low, the points aimed at the cold stone floor, a posture of profound uncertainty. They were soldiers, men trained to fight tangible enemies of steel and flesh. They had no protocol for a girl who could command light and banish death. Slowly, cautiously, they began to move. Not towards her, but around her. Joined by two other guards from the doorway, they formed a loose, unspoken circle. It was not an honor guard, it was a cage. Alara felt the shift in the room's atmosphere. The air, once thick with despair, was now charged with suspicion. She was no longer the invisible servant who had slipped through the cracks. She was an anomaly, a power unaccounted for. She could feel their fear like a chill on her skin. Her mother's warnings echoed in her mind, a frantic, desperate tolling of a bell, a light that draws shadows. Never reveal it to men of power or dogma. And here she was, trapped in a circle of swords, standing before a king, with the most dogmatic man in the kingdom staring at her as if she were a serpent. Exhaustion suddenly hit her like a physical blow. The magic had taken a heavy toll, leaving her bones feeling hollow and her muscles screaming. Her knees felt weak. She wanted to sink to the floor, to curl up and disappear. But she couldn't. The king's eyes still held hers. He was her only point of focus in a room that was beginning to swim. The heavy scent of medicinal incense, once a symbol of futile effort, now smelled cloying and pathetic. The only true thing in the room was the sound of the king's breath, deep and even. She had done that. She had given him that breath. The thought gave her a sliver of strength. "Tease her," Valerius commanded, his voice gaining a measure of its old confidence. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. "This is unsanctioned magic. The conclave must be summoned. We do not know what price she has paid for this spectacle, what dark pact she has made." The captain of the guard, a tall man with a grim, scarred face, finally moved. He took a step toward the bed, his gaze shifting from Valerius to Alara, and finally to the king. He was looking for his orders, and the usual chain of command was broken. Valerius was the physician, but the king was the king, even a weakened one. The guards tensed, their knuckles white on the hilts of their swords, waiting for the captain's signal. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had saved a life, and they were going to condemn her for it. She was trapped. But then a hand lifted from the bed. It was not a strong movement. It trembled with profound weakness, the muscles long unused and ravaged by fever. But it was a gesture of undeniable command. It was King Theron's hand. He did not touch the wound on his chest, which was now nothing more than a clean, closed line on his skin, the angry black veins having vanished completely. He did not reach for the goblet of water on his bedside table. His arm extended, his finger pointing, shaking slightly, directly at Alara. Every eye followed the gesture. The tension in the room grew taut enough to snap. Valerius's mouth opened, then closed again, his planned denunciation dying on his lips. The guards froze, their circle tightening almost imperceptibly. A dry, rasping sound came from the king's throat. It was the noise of a voice clawing its way back from the edge of oblivion. He cleared his throat, and his blue eyes, sharp as winter ice, narrowed with effort. He looked past Valerius, past the guards, past his own family. He looked only at the frightened girl in the simple brown dress. "Her," Theron rasped, the single word cutting through the silence with the force of a royal decree. A collective breath was held. He took another shallow, stabilizing breath, his gaze never leaving Alara's face. Then he spoke again, his voice a little stronger, filled with an authority that sickness could not erase. "She stays." The king's words were a scratch of breath, but they landed like stones. "Her, she stays." The command hung in the air, silencing the room more effectively than any shout. Alara stood frozen by the bed, the silvery light from her moon petal locket retracting into a soft, pulsing glow. The oppressive scent of decay was already thinning, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of ozone, like the air after a storm. Master Valerius stared, his jaw slack. His face, moments ago a mask of professional despair, was now a storm of conflicting emotions. Disbelief warred with humiliation. Awe fought a rising tide of bitter resentment. This girl, this nobody in a homespun dress, had succeeded where his lifetime of science had failed. He took a half step forward to condemn this wild magic, but the king's gaze, weak yet sharp as flint, was fixed entirely on Alara. The two guards who had moved to seize her were caught in suspended action. Their hands, which had reached for her arms, now hovered uselessly in the air. They were soldiers, trained to fight men and monsters, not to interpret miracles performed by tavern maids. One of them slowly lowered his sword arm. The other followed suit, his eyes wide with a fear that was turning to reverence. King Theron drew another breath, this one deeper, less of a struggle. With a surge of effort, he tried to push himself up on one elbow. A spasm of pain crossed his face, and he fell back against the pillows, his jaw clenched. Yet his voice held a new sliver of iron when it came again. "Leave us." He did not look at his mother or the terrified nobles by the door. His eyes remained on Alara. "All of you, out!" A murmur of protest rippled through the onlookers. The Queen Regent stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly. "Theron, my son, you are not well. We cannot leave you with—" She trailed off, unable to name what Alara was, a witch or a savior. "I am better than I have been in weeks," Theron countered, his voice gaining strength. "And I will be better still without a crowd of vultures hovering over my bed." He shifted his gaze to the tall, grim-faced captain of his guard. "Captain, you will remain. Everyone else, now." The order was undeniable. It was the king's voice, not the dying man's. Master Valerius was the first to move, turning on his heel. He did not look at Alara as he passed, but she felt the heat of his glare, a promise of future trouble. The other nobles scurried out after him, their whispers echoing in the corridor. The Queen Regent hesitated for a final, heartbreaking moment, her eyes pleading with her son. He gave a slight shake of his head. With a look of profound confusion at Alara, she too departed. The great oak doors boomed shut, sealing the room in a sudden, immense quiet. The air was no longer charged with public panic, but with a different kind of tension. Quieter but heavier. Alara was acutely aware of the captain standing a few paces behind her, a mountain of silent steel and leather. She was alone with the two most powerful men in the kingdom, and she had never felt so small or so terrifyingly exposed. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her mother's warning screamed in her mind, "A light that draws shadows. Never reveal it to men of power." She had just healed a king. The royal conclave would hear of this. They would come for her. The thought sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. She had saved his life only to surely forfeit her own. Her hand instinctively went to the locket, now cool against her skin, its secret gone dormant. "What is your name?" The king's voice startled her. It was soft, stripped of command, filled only with a quiet, weary curiosity. She looked at him. His piercing blue eyes, no longer clouded by pain, studied her with unnerving intensity. She had to swallow before she could speak. "Alara," she whispered. The name felt foreign on her own tongue, a fragile thing offered up in this chamber of power. "Alara," he repeated, the name a soft murmur. He seemed to be tasting the sound of it, fitting it to the face of the woman who had pulled him back from the edge. He let out a long, slow breath, the first truly peaceful one he had taken in what felt like a lifetime. The hard lines of pain etched around his eyes began to soften. He propped himself up slightly against the mound of pillows, his focus never leaving her face. "You have done what my entire kingdom could not," he said, his voice firmer. "My physicians, my priests, my coffers of gold, all useless." His eyes traced the simple fabric of her dress, her calloused hands. "And you walked in from nowhere and gave me back my life. I am in your debt." The words were a formal declaration, a binding promise spoken by a king. For an instant, Alara felt relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. The debt of a king was a shield. It was protection. It meant the conclave could not simply drag her away. But the relief was immediately followed by a cold dread. The debt of a king was also a chain. It bound her to this world of power and politics, a world she had spent her life hiding from. She had wanted only to heal and then disappear. But she saw now in the king's unwavering gaze that there was no going back. The exertion, combined with the release from the curse, was finally too much for Theron. The focus in his eyes began to blur. A deep, profound weariness settled over his features. His eyelids grew heavy. He fought it for a moment, as if afraid to lose sight of her, afraid this was all a dream from which he might awake and still dying. But only a sigh escaped him. His head settled deeper into the pillows. His breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, rhythmic cadence of true healing sleep. The crisis was over. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sleeping king and the crackling fire. Strength drained from Alara's own limbs as if a plug had been pulled. The magic had taken its toll, a deep exhaustion that settled into her bones. Her legs began to tremble and she stumbled back a step, sinking into an ornate chair by the bedside. She had not been invited to sit, but no one stopped her. The captain of the guard remained at his post, a silent statue. But she saw him turn his head slightly, his gaze falling upon her for a long moment. There was no threat in his look now, only a quiet, grudging respect. He was guarding his king, but he was also guarding the king's healer. Alara leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, and buried her face in her hands. She did not cry. She was too empty for tears. She was a tavern maid, and now she sat in the royal chamber, her fate tied to the man sleeping peacefully before her. She was no longer a prisoner, but his protector. The first thing Alara felt was the cold. It seeped up from the stone floor, through the thin soles of her shoes and the rough fabric of her dress, a deep chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She stirred, her neck aching from the awkward angle she had slept in. For a moment she was back in her tiny attic room at the Weary Wanderer, expecting the familiar scent of stale ale and baking bread. But the air here was different. It smelled of clean linen, dried herbs, and the faint, metallic memory of blood, now thankfully fading. She opened her eyes. The king was still breathing. Sunlight, pale and thin, streamed through a high, arched window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. King Theron lay in the enormous bed, his chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. The angry black veins that had marred his skin were gone, replaced by the clean line of a healing wound. The oppressive aura of decay that had choked the room for weeks had vanished, leaving behind a profound stillness. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He was alive. He was truly healing. She had done it. The thought did not bring triumph, only a wave of bone-deep exhaustion so immense it felt like a physical weight. The heavy chamber door opened with a soft click. The captain of the guard, the same one who had stood stoically through the entire ordeal, entered the room. His gaze went first to the king, a flicker of relief crossing his stern features, then to Alara. He gave a short, formal bow of his head. "The king is stable," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "His Majesty's command was that you were to be cared for. A room has been prepared for you. You will be escorted." He spoke with the detached precision of a man used to giving orders, yet there was a new note in his voice when he addressed her. It was not quite deference, but a grudging respect. Alara simply nodded, too tired to speak. She tried to stand, but her legs were stiff and unresponsive. The captain gestured, and two servants, a man and a woman who had been waiting in the hall, scurried inside. They moved with a practiced quietness, their eyes avoiding Alara's, as if she were a ghost or a saint. They had not yet decided which. They helped her to her feet, their touch gentle but impersonal. And as they guided her from the room, she cast one last look at the sleeping king, a strange and unwelcome sense of ownership settling in her heart. She was no longer just a tavern maid. She was the woman who had saved the king, and she had no idea what that meant. Her new chambers were not grand, but compared to her life at the inn, they were a palace. They were located in a quiet wing of the keep, close to the royal suite. There was a proper bed with a thick wool blanket, a small fireplace already laid with fresh wood, and a narrow window overlooking a private courtyard. On a simple wooden chest at the foot of the bed lay a set of clothes. They were not silks or velvets, but finely woven wool and soft linen in muted shades of gray and blue. A practical dress, a warm cloak, sturdy leather boots. Someone had understood she was not a court lady. She was a worker, and her work was not yet finished. The first few days passed in a blur of this new, strange reality. Each morning she would wake in the soft bed, eat a meal brought by a silent servant, and then be escorted back to the king's chambers. There she would spend hours by his side. The curse was broken, but its taint lingered, a shadow that needed to be cleansed. She would open her moon petal locket, letting its silvery light wash over him. She would place her hands just above his wound and chant the old words her mother had taught her, feeling the last vestiges of dark magic dissolve under her touch like smoke in the wind. Theron grew stronger with each passing day. The fever was gone and color returned to his face. Soon he was able to sit up, propped against a mountain of pillows. And then he began to talk. At first it was just questions about his condition. How much longer? Is the poison truly gone? Alara would answer him in her quiet, concise way. But as his physical strength returned, his curiosity shifted. He began to ask about her. Alara, he said one afternoon, his voice, though still weak, regaining its natural deep timbre. Tell me about your home, the inn. He looked at her with those piercing blue eyes, now clear of pain, and filled with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. She hesitated. No one of importance had ever asked about her life. It was a life lived in the background, a series of simple, repetitive tasks. There is not much to tell, Your Majesty, she murmured, her gaze fixed on the locket in her hands. There is everything to tell, he insisted gently. I command armies and sign treaties. I have never poured a mug of ale in my life. Tell me. And so she did. She spoke of the weary wanderer, of the low smoke-stained ceilings and the smell of roasting meat. She described Giles the innkeeper with his booming laugh and his perpetual worry over his dwindling supply of good cider. She told him about the travelers, the merchants, the farmers, and the gossip they brought from every corner of the kingdom. She painted a picture of a world he ruled but had never truly seen, a world of small struggles and simple joys. He listened, completely captivated. He would ask questions that were surprisingly astute. Do the farmers believe the grain tariffs are fair? What do the common soldiers say about the campaign in the north when they think no officers are listening? She answered as honestly as she could, realizing that for the first time the whispers she had overheard for years had a purpose. She was giving the king a window into his own kingdom. In return, he started to share pieces of his own world. He never complained about the burden of his crown, but she could hear it in the weariness of his voice. My father believed a king must be harder than the stone of his castle, Theron confessed one evening, staring into the flickering fire. He taught me strategy, statecraft, how to wield a sword. He never taught me what to do when your allies are plotting against you in your own court. He spoke of the endless political maneuvering, the thinly veiled ambitions of powerful lords, and the crushing loneliness of the throne. He told her about the battle at the northern border, where he had been wounded. He did not describe it as a heroic charge, but as a chaotic, terrifying mess of mud and steel. He spoke of the sorcerous warlord who wielded Sorrow's kiss, and the chilling emptiness in the man's eyes. In these quiet hours, the vast gulf between them seemed to shrink. He was not King Theron, ruler of Silverspire Keep. She was not Alara, the tavern maid with a dangerous secret. They were just two people, trapped by their circumstances, finding a strange solace in each other's company. She saw the man behind the crown, burdened and isolated. He saw the strength behind her quiet demeanor, a power that had nothing to do with titles or wealth. A fragile, unspoken bond began to form between them, woven from shared words and silent understanding. But the world outside the king's chambers had not forgotten them. While Alara was healing Theron, Master Valerius was nursing his wounded pride. His entire professional life had been built on being the kingdom's preeminent healer, a master of established lore and scientific method. A simple serving girl with folk magic had succeeded where he and his immaculate instruments had failed. It was an intolerable humiliation. His disbelief had quickly curdled into suspicion, and then into a cold, calculated fury. He could not accept that her power was genuine. It had to be something dark, something forbidden. The blow came on a crisp autumn morning, a week after Alara had first entered the keep. She was in her room, mending a small tear in her new cloak, when the captain of the guard knocked on her door. His face was grim, his posture even more rigid than usual. In his gloved hand, he held a rolled parchment, sealed with the severe interlocking circles of the royal conclave. "This is for you," he said, his voice low. "It is a formal summons." Alara's blood ran cold. She took the scroll, her calloused fingers trembling as she broke the wax seal. The script was elegant, precise, and utterly menacing. It accused her of practicing forbidden arts. It mentioned blood magic, a heinous crime punishable by public trial and purification by fire. The final line stated that Master Valerius himself had lodged the formal complaint, citing the unnatural speed of the king's recovery as evidence of a demonic pact. Her mother's warning echoed in her mind, sharp as a scream. Never reveal your gift to men of power or dogma. Valerius was the embodiment of both. The conclave holds authority in all matters of magic, the captain explained, seeing the color drain from her face. Not even the king can dismiss their inquiries out of hand. They are demanding an audience, a demonstration of your methods. A demonstration. They wanted her to perform her sacred, secret art like a carnival trick, for a panel of arrogant men who had already judged her. The fear she thought she had conquered came rushing back, suffocating her. They would take her locket. They would dissect her magic, label it unclean, and then they would destroy her. When Theron learned of the summons, his rage was a palpable force in the room. He had been taking a short walk around his chambers, testing his strength, but he immediately sat back down, his face a thunderous mask. "How dare he snarled, crushing the parchment in his fist. "How dare Valerius question a gift that saved my life? I will not allow it." He looked at Alara, at the terror in her eyes, and his anger was suddenly sharpened by a fierce protective instinct. "I am the king. In this castle, my word is final." "But the captain said," Alara began, her voice barely a whisper. "The conclave has its own laws, its own power." "Their power exists because my ancestors granted it," Theron countered, his voice like cold iron. "They have forgotten their place. I will remind them." He looked ready to summon his guards and have Valerius thrown in the deepest dungeon. But they both knew it was not that simple. The conclave was an ancient institution, deeply woven into the fabric of the kingdom's power structure. To openly defy them would risk a constitutional crisis, something the kingdom, already weakened, could not afford. The warlord in the north was defeated but not gone. Ambitious lords were always watching for any sign of royal weakness. A new battle had begun, one that would be fought not with swords, but with laws, influence, and fear. Alara was at its center, her life hanging in the balance. The quiet sanctuary she and Theron had built in his sick room was shattered. The outside world, with all its threats and politics, had come crashing in. That night, she went to his room for the final healing session. The mood was heavy with unspoken tension. The guards at the door seemed more watchful. The shadows in the corners of the room felt deeper. Theron was silent, his jaw set as he sat on the edge of his bed, watching her. Alara tried to focus, to push away the gnawing fear in the conclave's judgment. She needed to finish what she had started. She took out the moon petal locket. Its light seemed dimmer tonight, or perhaps it was just the darkness in her own heart. She knelt before him, placing her hands over the now faint scar on his side. It was barely visible, a thin silver line on his skin, but she could still feel a trace of the curse, a cold echo deep within the tissue. She closed her eyes and began the chant, the ancient words, a comforting anchor in the storm of her fear. The silver light from the locket pulsed softly, warming the space between her palms and his skin. She focused all her energy, all her will, on that final lingering remnant of darkness, pushing it out, cleansing it completely. She was so lost in her work that she did not see him move. Suddenly, a warmth covered her hands. Her eyes snapped open. Theron had placed his own hand over hers. It was large and firm, calloused from sword and rain, and it completely enveloped her smaller ones. The chant died on her lips. Her breath caught in her throat. His hand was not just resting there. It was a deliberate, protective weight, a shield of flesh and bone over her magic, over her secret. The silver light of the locket glowed between their palms, a captured star. He said nothing. He just looked at her, his blue eyes holding hers, and in that single silent moment, a current passed between them. It was a promise of protection, a declaration of alliance, an acknowledgement of a bond that now ran far deeper than that of a king and his subject. The brief electric touch said more than any words they had ever shared. The air in the throne room was thick enough to taste. It was a mixture of expensive perfume, dust from ancient tapestries, and the sharp, undeniable scent of fear. Alara stood in a shadowed alcove, her new silk dress feeling like a borrowed skin. Just weeks ago, she had been wiping down tables at the Weary Wanderer. Now she was a specter in the heart of power, waiting for a verdict that could either elevate her or end her. Her hands, though clean, still felt the phantom grit of coarse soap and splintered wood. She instinctively clutched the moonpetal locket through the fine fabric, its familiar cool shape a small anchor in this overwhelming sea of silk and steel. Across the polished marble floor, she saw him. Master Valerius stood near the front of the gathered nobles, his silver-trimmed robes immaculate. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the empty throne, a smug, proprietary confidence in the line of his shoulders. He had filed his complaint with the royal conclave. He had presented his case with bold academic precision, painting Alara's light as a dark and forbidden art. Whispers had followed her through the stone halls for days, words like witch and charlatan clinging to her like burrs. Now Valerius stood as the voice of order and tradition, expecting the king to reaffirm his authority and banish the anomaly. He looked like a man who was certain he had already won. Then the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall swung open. Two royal guards, their armor gleaming, stepped aside. A hush fell over the assembly, so sudden and complete that the flutter of a banner high in the rafters was a loud intrusion. King Theron entered the room. He did not look like a man who had been clinging to life. He was tall and straight, his black hair washed and neatly tied back. The scar through his eyebrow, a stark white line against his healthy skin. He wore the deep blue tunic of his office, the silver crown of the kingdom resting firmly on his head. His steps were measured and strong, each one echoing with an authority that had been absent for months. He was not just recovered. He was reborn in fire and shadow, and his eyes held the cold light of a winter star. His gaze swept across the room, missing nothing. He saw the nervous shuffling of the lords, the calculating expressions of the council members, and the triumphant smirk on Master Valerius's face. His eyes paused on Valerius for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, a flicker of something dangerous passed between them. Then his gaze found Alara in the shadows. For a heartbeat, the hardness in his expression softened, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them alone. He saw her, not as the court did, but as the woman who had knelt by his bed and pulled him back from the brink. Theron ascended the dais and turned to face the court, but he did not sit. He stood before the throne, a living symbol of the power it represented. "My lords, members of the conclave," he began, his voice ringing with renewed strength. "I have summoned you today to address a matter of grave importance." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. They expected a speech about border security, or perhaps a decree about the warlord who had wounded him. No one was prepared for what came next. It concerns the accusations of forbidden magic leveled against the woman who saved my life. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Alara of the Weary Wanderer Inn stepped forward. The name of her old home felt like a ghost on his tongue. It was a deliberate choice, a reminder to everyone of her humble origins. The whispers grew louder now, a hostile hiss of disbelief and scorn. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to find a dark corner and disappear. But then she met Theron's eyes again. He gave a barely perceptible nod, a silent command, and a promise of protection. She took a breath, pushed herself away from the wall, and walked into the center of the throne room. The space between her and the dais felt a mile long. The stares of the nobles were physical things, pressing in on her, judging the simple cut of her dress, the way she held her hands, the plainness of her face. She stopped at the foot of the steps, her head held high. Theron looked down, not at her, but at Master Valerius. "Master Valerius," the king said, his voice dangerously calm, You have claimed that her methods are a perversion of the healing arts. You have called her magic wild and uncontrolled. You who stood over my deathbed and told my family to prepare for my funeral. The blood drained from Valerius's face. His smugness evaporated, replaced by a dawning horror. The king had turned his own words into a weapon. You offered incense and empty platitudes while a curse devoured me from within, Theron continued, his voice rising with cold fury. You and your conclave, with all your approved methods and ancient texts, were utterly useless. A collective gasp went through the room. No one had ever spoken to the head of the royal physicians with such open contempt. Theron turned his attention back to the wider court. This woman, this tavern maid, came to me when all hope was lost. She did not use your approved methods. She used a light that your dogma has tried to extinguish for centuries. She wielded a power born of empathy, not arrogance, a power that did not fail. He let that sink in. The royal conclave has deemed her magic forbidden. As of this moment, I, your king, deem it a royal treasure. He descended one step from the dais, closing the distance between them. He extended his hand. Alara hesitated for only a second before placing her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, warm grip that sent a jolt through her. It was not the fleeting touch from the sick room. This was a public declaration, a binding. Master Valerius, Theron said, his eyes never leaving Alara's, you will retract your complaint. The royal conclave will issue a formal apology to her, and you will begin a new chapter in your scrolls, one dedicated to the study of the light she commands, so that this kingdom is never left so defenseless again. It was a complete and utter humiliation. Valerius, trembling slightly, could only bow his head and whisper, "Yes, your majesty." Theron then looked at Alara, his voice softening so only she could hear. Your old life is over. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Then raising his voice for the entire court to witness, he declared, I name Alara my personal advisor. She will have chambers adjoining my own. Her voice will be heard in my council, and her counsel will be given the same weight as my own. She saved the king. Now she will help the king save his kingdom. He pulled her gently up the final step, so she stood beside him, on the dais, looking out at the stunned faces of the most powerful people in the land. They were no longer peers. She was above them. Her hand was steady in his, the memory of calluses meeting the reality of his grip. Before the silent court, she was no longer a shadow from an inn. She was the light that would help guide his reign. She met the king's gaze, her hand held firmly in his, and saw not just a man she had saved, but a future she had never dared to imagine. A future she would now face by his side. What would you have done? One line in the comments, let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.